Welcome back. In the last segment, we talked a bit about Nixon, and we covered a lot about Nixon.
And his dirty tricks and Donald Segretti.
Now, I want to know what he thought, when they started looking into Segretti once he got in trouble. What is Nixon thinking?
That's where we left it. Was we had Dean talking to Nixon, explaining all the problems to him. That's in the tape in the Nixon library. It's called "The Cancer and the Presidency." There's a couple of interesting things in there that are said about Donald Segretti. First of all, Dean tells Nixon that this might involve felony exposure.
Well, the Segretti thing, let's get down to that. I think Bob has indicated to me he's told you a lot of it. No, the felony, in this instance being a potential use of one of the civil rights statutes for anybody who interferes with a candidate for national office, interferes with their campaign in any way.
What do we take away here?
Okay, so that's Dean describing all of this, and he's talking about Segretti, and Nixon sort of takes the view that this was all just dirty tricks, and Dean's trying to tell him this, look, there's a statute that could apply to interfering with a campaign, so Dean is telling him that this could be a felony, and when Dean explains to Nixon what the felony is, interfering with an election campaign, one of Nixon's responses was really, really interesting. He says he doesn't understand why basically dirty tricks in sport would be an interference with an election campaign when, in fact, something like that should be applied to these protesters. He refers to these protesters. Play clip number 17.
Why is it under civil rights statute to pick up any of these clowns that are demonstrating against us? Well, I've argued that they use that for that very purpose. Really? Yes, I have. And those were us interfering with the campaign. That's exactly right. But they ready, and I think I'm not as concerned about that because it's so bad the way it's been put out on the PR side, and I think it'll actually end up on the PR side of very confused. It'll look bad, and that's a period that I can't see it. Right, I may be wrong.
All right, we need some high-end forensic analysis of this tape because I can't understand what they're saying.
All right, so I'll put up a transcript on the video. Let me pull out two quick clips here. He says, first of all, Nixon says at the end of that, he says, the Segretti thing, I'm not as concerned about that. He wasn't as concerned about the Segretti thing, but what he had said at the very beginning there is he didn't understand why the civil rights statute couldn't be used to pick up any of these clowns that were demonstrating against us. Because his argument there was that the counterculture and the people who were, demonstrating against the Vietnam War, they were the ones who were actually interfering with his, campaign and treating him unfairly, whereas the Segretti thing was just a bunch of sport in his eyes.
Oh, the protesters.
Right.
So he's saying the protesters are the clowns
doing
things wrong. They're interfering with my ability to rule.
Right. So
and Nixon is just playing for sport.
Yeah, so that shows you how talented he was on that. In addition, they're talking about Herb, the personal attorney of Nixon, saying Herb, I don't think Herb broke any laws. All he did is pay him. Let's listen to Nixon's attitudes about this. Play clip number 20.
I don't know of anything that Herb has done that is illegal, other than the fact that he doesn't want to blow the whistle on a lot of people and may find himself in a perjury situation. What will happen is when they call him up there, and he of course has no immunity, they'll say, how did you pay Mr. Segretti? Well, I had cash on hand. Well, how much cash did you have on hand? Where did you go from there? Where did you get the cash?
Dean is telling him, look, once he gets called, he doesn't have immunity. And so Herb is going to have to say, yeah, I paid him. And they're going to ask, well, where'd you get the money? Well, it's a leftover campaign funds. And they were funding the junior varsity team. If you gave money to the Nixon campaign in 1968, then they would be used to help fund Segretti in the 72 re-election campaign. So they were discussing that angle of it. There's another interesting one here. When Dean tells Nixon that the operatives have switched their attention from the primary to the general, they were screwing around with Muskie and Humphrey and this sort of thing. Eventually, the operatives are going to put their attention toward McGovern. And this is interesting what Nixon's reaction is to this. He basically says, McGovern, why would we do it to him? Play clip number 15.
I'm just trying to think as to why that. We just finished the Moscow trip. I mean, that's right. Democrats were just nominated about McGovern. I mean, for Christ's sakes, what the hell? I didn't see you ever heard. I can see the pressure, but I don't see why all the pressure was on then.
I can see the pressure. Wait.
Okay, so I'll put the transcript up on the video so you can see that too. But here's what he had said. First of all, he had said, we just did the Moscow trip. That was a good foreign policy trip. Nixon had these interesting foreign policy agreements. His polls were really high. And he says, point blank, I can see doing it earlier, referring to everything that was done to Muskie and the buggings and all that. But he says, McGovern, for Christ's sakes, I mean, why were we worried about that guy? Is basically what his point was.
He's a buffoon. Who's going to vote for him anyways? He's the Bernie Sanders of the day.
I think that was the point. Was Nixon wanted to run against McGovern, and so he couldn't see why they would have put their bugging operations toward him.
Is that an admission of guilt?
One of the reasons why the president resigned is that there was all this stuff on the tape. So we haven't even shown it. This show is just showing you about Segretti and the dirty tricks. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff on this tape, concerning Watergate and criminality. One of the things was that, he's discussing how to raise money to pay off witnesses, and so there's all kinds of stuff on these tapes that show that the president is involved in this. And so that's the reason why he resigned. He also resigned because his party was abandoning him. It looked like he was clearly going to get impeached, and in the Senate, it looked like he couldn't be saved over there either. It looks like he was going to lose votes over there.
Controlled?
The Democrats controlled these institutions, but it still required Republican defections. There was a meeting with Barry Goldwater, and it was pretty much clearly communicated to Nixon that he wasn't going to have the votes that he thought he was going to have. And so that's when Nixon decided to leave.
They needed a majority back then too, right?
They needed 2/3. They need 2/3 to eject in the Senate.
More, okay.
Yeah, so that's why you always need approval from the rival party. Why don't we do this? Having just looked at what Nixon was doing here and how he reacted to it, let's get into the really juicy part of this. Why don't we come back and talk about whether we can make any comparisons to Trump?
Your only source for truly balanced politics. Broadcast from Wright State University, this is Good Politics with Dr. Sean Wilson and Adam Whiteman.